We're back on this hypothetical situation that isn't very hypothetical, with a vendor not meeting a due date, and what can you do? The vendor's the one that requests the modification to extend the due date. So we've gone through, yes, you can do a modification depending on the circumstances. And here's the things continuing on what you might do either with a modification or in lieu of a modification. And we've went through the issue of, it's one thing if it's they're not meeting it because of excusable delay. There's another thing if it's not something that's excusable. So continuing on the basis of it's not excusable, you again can require a remediation plan. And we've talked about one of the prior slides, you might increase insurance or bonding or liquidated damages, meetings, reports, things of this nature. For a remediation plan, you might get the vendor to say, I'm going to devote more people. That maybe the root cause is I don't have enough people working on the project, or the right people. So maybe that is something you'll get, the change of either more or different people. So the first one is more, the second one is different. Maybe something other than people, maybe a new software program, maybe more equipment, something of that nature. Or maybe they add a subcontractor, that they acknowledge that it's something they're having difficulties to go out and get more help. So those things you can do if you're going to continue with that vendor via modification to extend, or here's some other things you could do. Just say no. They are not meeting the due date. They ask for a modification, and what you can do is say no, and instead you can terminate the contract for default. If it's not an excusable delay and they're not meeting it, you can simply say, that's it. We're putting you on notice that it's default situation, and terminate. And if you do that, you could try to do it with state personnel. That's a contingency. Or you might award an emergency contract to complete, or do something else. So those are alternatives. Now let me take the same situation and put another wrinkle to it. Vendor is not going to meet the required time frame. They ask for a modification to extend, but along with requesting a modification to extend, what if they now say, oh, and because this is taking longer than we intended, under the premise that time is money, we want more money in addition to extending the time frame. Now what would you do? So even if you agree to extend, would you pay them more money? No. Anybody else? How many people say no? How many people say yes? Anybody say yes? Anybody say, haven't a finished idea, get on with it? Tell me what the answer is. Depends. Depends. You're right. That's always the right answer. Almost. Almost always the right answer. If the delay was caused by the state or its contractors, maybe additional payment is warranted as an equitable adjustment. It depends on whether the vendor can document valid additional expenses. If the delay is excusable, but not caused by the state or its contractors, probably not. If the delay is not excusable, in large letters, in color, bolded, the answer is no. If the vendor's not producing and there's nothing that is the state's fault or something, another contractor beyond the control of the vendor, and they want more money, it's like, no, go away. I mean, it's one thing for you to not do it and then you want more money because it's taking you longer than it's supposed to take you. Just go away. Do the work. No more money. All right. Let's see. This is not a specific situation, but this is a typical, unfortunately, a typical situation. A new procurement was not undertaken by the state in time for a follow-up contract to be awarded and commenced by the time the current contract is to expire. And that's never happened in the state, right? Never had a situation where a contract is due to expire and we don't have the replacement contract in place. I know this is fiction, but just in case this might ever happen, let's see what we might do in this situation. So if that's the case, can the current contract be modified to extend it if the contractor is willing to do so? How many people think yes?
Yes. Doing
How many people think no?
doing it already.
Not if there is no additional funding in the contract, then if there's no money available in the current contract.
If there's no funding to do it,
Right,
then obviously you wouldn't extend.
right.
But if you were going to have a follow-up contract, then presumably there is money to pay for the follow-up contract. But you're right, if there's no money, no, contract has to end.
Yep. Do it on an emergency basis only.
Well, if there's no money, can't do an emergency either.
If it breaks down, you got to have.
Bottom line, if you don't have any money, you can't pay for it, you can't do it. You may want it, but if you can't pay for it, you can't do it. All right, so you don't have the procurement in place. You have to go to the vendor and ask the vendor to continue. It's not the vendor coming to you, you're going to the vendor and saying, because I don't have something ready as a follow-up, will you continue to provide services? The contract can be extended for a period of time that is reasonably sufficient to permit the recompetition and resulting award. The approval needed for such an extension depends on the value of the payments to be made to the contractor during the extension period. If the value exceeds $50,000, the BPW must approve the extension unless the subject contract is exempt from Board of Public Works approval. And one other caveat, the board about 2 years ago issued a revised advisory on modifications, and that revised revision said that if, when you have a contract first approved by the board, you have a statement in there that something to the effect that allows you to continue the contract without additional cost if the approved money has not been expended, then as long as you still have money that you don't have to get an additional appropriation or additional approval from the board, you can continue to extend to, in so many words, use up the previously approved monetary amount. Did I say that right? Well, I don't know if it's very good. I don't know. Did everyone understand? DGS probably uses that frequently. That's something that's used a lot in construction and maintenance. But so the bottom line is, yes, if we have to go to them and ask them to continue and they're willing to continue, yes, we can continue. We may need approval by the control agency, may need approval by the Board of Public Works, but unfortunately this kind of thing happens fairly often.
Do they have to continue at the same price?
I think you have anticipated the next slide.
Okay.
Let me see if you have that crystal ball to know what's coming.
And one thing, Joe, the lawyers have said is you can't extend these things. It has to be reasonable and logical why you're going to do this. You can't be doing this to circumvent or avoid taking some sort of a full-blown procurement action. So,
You mean this reasonably sufficient to permit the recompetition?
yes, and not circumvent or avoid is what the lawyers have said.
Yeah, we had something from an unknown agency that I'm getting the vibrations of the agency as I stand here. That when we had a board item that came down to us, I think within the past 2 months, it said the agency wanted to do a 2-year extension of a contract. And the first thing we said is, why? And the answer was that they wanted to do an extension to implement some new requirement of the federal government. And we said, okay, but there's no way that takes 2 years to implement that. Why do you want a 2-year extension? Excuse me. And the final answer came back that they had confused the extension with a renewal option. And what came down to us was they wanted a 2-year extension when they wanted to do a couple months. They wanted to implement and raise the money to do this new requirement, and then they wanted to exercise a renewal option. But it didn't come down that way. And our first answer was, in so many words, no. That doesn't make sense. So you just can't do it for a period of time that doesn't seem reasonable for what's involved. And the longer it is, the more difficulty you're going to have getting it through DBM and the board. So the more you're going to have to justify the duration that you're asking for. Let's see. The contract. All right, so we went back. Let's see. If the value of the extension, so it's not on the next slide, but it's coming up. If the value of the extension is $50,000 or less, the appropriate control agency must approve the modification unless the subject contract is exempt or unless the modification is within the level of delegation. But frequently, modifications valued between $25,000 and $50,000 must be reported on a procurement agency activity report. If you've never heard of a PAR before, each of the control agencies, DBM, DoIT, DGS, Transportation, must monthly report to the Board of Public Works items over $25,000 but below the threshold to go to the board for something requiring specific board approval of the things that the control agency approved. So one way or another, the Board of Public Works is going to see these things, either as a specific board item or on a PAR report. All right, now we have the question. What if the contractor is only willing to extend if it gets a higher rate of payment than under the current contract? Can it be paid a higher rate? So again, the scenario is we're going to the vendor, we're asking the vendor to extend because we don't have a follow-up contract in place. So if the vendor is okay to do it, we've just seen that it's permissible to do an extension for time. What if the vendor wants not just the same rate, but more money during the period of extension? Can you do it? Yes, I saw a head shake. Yeah, no. How many people say yes? 1, 2, 3, 4. Gary has both hands up. Mark. You're not supposed to tip off the answer. How many people say no? After I've seen Mark with both hands, no, I'm not going to say no. Okay. Response, yes, it can. Excuse me. The prohibition against paying more money under a contract doesn't apply because the original contract would end if the state hadn't requested an extension. The vendor did not, the vendor was able to talk in contrast to the instructor. The vendor did not originally contract to provide the contract activity during the period of the extension for the same price as during the contract period, as it would for an option period. So the fact that the contract is being extended means there is an increase in deliverable. The extended duration is the increase. So there can be more money paid. The only issue is commensurate now, which is what the top one says. But while it is permissible to pay more money during the extension period, the agency should always try to have the contract extended for the same price as under the current contract or negotiate the lowest payment increase possible. Your first answer is going to be to go to the vendor and try to get them to do it at the same rate, or maybe even a decrease. Gee, you're getting a longer period of time, more than you expected. So you've already taken care of all your incurred expenses. You've amortized your expenses, so maybe you can do it for even less. And after the vendor laughs at you, because you're going to the vendor who has the upper hand, then you can say, well, at least do it at the same rate. And usually, you can get the vendor to do it at the same rate. But a lot of people have the notion that there's an absolute prohibition when you go to the vendor and ask them to extend. And even though we always try to get what's the best deal for the state, it is not a prohibition when we're asking the vendor to do something beyond what the contract would have entailed, and in this case, work beyond the ending date. So if that's the only way you can get them, yes, you can pay more money. Any questions? All right, let's see. And the agency should consider alternative actions to perform what is currently being done by the contractor before agreeing to a price increase that it considers exorbitant. So yes, you can pay more, but as we said, it needs to be commensurate. You need to think it's reasonable. And if you don't think it's reasonable, then before you say yes, look to see what else you can do other than simply acquiescing to the vendor and paying whatever they ask for. Can you do an emergency, small procurement, go under a master contract, interagency, do it yourself, do without? Any of these things rather than paying what the vendor wants. But if it isn't practical to do without or do anything as an alternative, maybe we have to pay what the vendor demands if we have no alternative, which is why it isn't good to be in a position where the vendor has the upper hand. I mean, that's what the upper hand means. We have to, for the most part, take what they're offering rather than what we should be doing where they take what we're offering. Any questions? Moving along to another example. When an incumbent contractor is notified that it is not selected for the award of the follow-up contract, it files a protest. And I know this is totally theoretical. No one can ever think of a situation where an incumbent isn't selected and it files a protest, right? Never happened. So I know I'm out on a limb here with just the possibility. So in this hypothetical situation, the incumbent doesn't win. As soon as it's told it doesn't win, it files a protest. And the agency denies the protest because it's usually a relatively short period of time to deny the protest, a week, a couple weeks. But once you have an appeal to the Board of Contract Appeals, you're usually into a many-month process. And the last couple I've been directly or indirectly involved with have gone anywhere from 11 months to 18 months to finally get to a resolution. I'm not saying that's a typical time frame, but once you're into an appeal and the lawyer's asking for documents and having hearings and having stuff before you have hearings and having additional protests because of what is learned at hearings, the whole bit, it usually goes on for at least 6 months and frequently up to a year. So because of these actions, the follow-up contract usually cannot be awarded. And the rules are that if there's a protest or an appeal, that unless you go to the Board of Public Works and ask for the Board of Public Works to approve a new award in the face of protest, we must hold off the award until there's a resolution of the protest and the appeal. So unless we're going to the Board of Public Works for approval in the face of protest, we're going to take the 6, 8, 9, 10, 12 months to get to a decision by the Board of Contract Appeals. And so the answer might be, all right, well, rather than take the 8, 9, 12 months, why don't we just ask for the Board of Public Works to approve in the face of protest? Because the board doesn't like to do that. Because we, DBM, doesn't like to do that. Because what you're doing is saying to a vendor, there's this appeal process. But because you're actually availing yourself of this appeal process, we're going to pull the legs out from underneath you and go and get the board, ask the Board of Public Works to approve it, despite the fact that you're taking advantage of the process that's there to supposedly make the process fair. And so the Board of Public Works doesn't like to do that. And most of the time, not that this happens frequently, but 50% or more of the time that an agency does go to the Board of Public Works to ask for approval, notwithstanding protest, the Board of Public Works does not approve it. And if they don't, you have to wait. At this point in time, we know that one of the 3 board members unequivocally will not and has not voted for an item in the face of protest. As DHMH knows from 2 years ago or 18 months ago, took an item to the board that was going to save $20 million over 3 years or 5 years?
5 years.
5 years. Save $4 million a year over the current contract. And because of the money savings and because to avoid the protracted appeal process, during which if it took 9 months, it was going to cost the state $2.5 million just to continue to pay the same rate while the appeal went through. So with our support, DHMH went to the board and asked for approval, notwithstanding the fact there was a protest. And even though there's $20 million at issue, the controller still voted against it. The treasurer was very much on the fence and ultimately voted for it, but with a couple conditions. And so even $20 million almost wasn't enough to get approval from the Board of Public Works to eliminate the appeal process. So it isn't something you should count on.
Want to do the follow-up on that? The next day, the protesting vendor cancels the protest?
Follow-up was, and this was a shock, that after the Board of Public Works approved the contract, notwithstanding protest, and this was appealed to the Board of Contract Appeals. The next day, the vendor who had appealed the item to the Board of Contract Appeals withdrew its appeal because the Board of Public Works has already approved it. What do I have to gain? So they withdrew their appeal. And one of the questions from both the treasurer and the controller was, what happens if we, the Board of Public Works, approve this item and it continues on to the Board of Contract Appeals and the Board of Contract Appeals upholds the appeal of the vendor? What happens? And they could not be given a good answer because it's never happened. And one of the reasons it never happened is most vendors, if the Board of Public Works approves something, don't go through with the appeal because they figure, what's the use? And as long as they continue that way, we're fine. Although the bad thing is the Board of Public Works doesn't like to have battles at the Board of Public Works. And inevitably, if we have an item in the face of protest for the board to approve, that we just transfer the forum for the debate from the Board of Contract Appeals to the Board of Public Works. So the lawyers show up at the Board of Public Works and or argue their case before the Board of Public Works as to, give me my contract, no, let me go to the Board of Contract Appeals, don't award it. No, here's why you should award it. Well, here's why you shouldn't award it. And I have been at the board where it's taken like an hour of intense back and forth and accusations of what's right and what's wrong and what the agency didn't do and what the agency did do. And the Board of Public Works is sitting there with the information that they're hearing in front of them and making a decision, yes, I should or no, I shouldn't. And usually their answer is to the agencies, don't put me in this situation, don't bring things to us for approval, notwithstanding protest, unless there are very extenuating circumstances. So, going back to this issue, that's why most of the time if there's a protest and it is, while the protest is live or if it's been appealed, then for the most part we cannot award a contract. Not that we cannot absolutely, but for the most part we don't. So if we can't award a new contract, what do we do? The first thing we almost inevitably do is, well, instead of saying what we do, let me ask the question. So going back to this situation, the incumbent appeals the agency's protest denial. Because of these actions, the follow-up contract usually cannot be awarded, so the current contract needs to be extended. The current contractor, who is the protester, agrees to the extension. Can you extend? Should you extend? How many people think you can extend? How many people think you cannot extend? You don't think you can extend? Because they're protesting and they're wrong.
They weren't qualified to be chosen as the apparent responsive low bidder. So why are we going to extend the contract to them?
Because they're claiming you did something wrong. Protest means the agency did something wrong. They erred in the selection. And it's almost always one of two things. Either you're biased, depends on whether it's a low bid situation. If it's low bid, well, the vendor you selected was non-responsive. You should have thrown them out, or they were non-responsible. So they should have been thrown out, I'm next in line, you should award to me. You should not have let them in if it's low bid. If it's evaluated, it's either you're biased against me, and usually with that is the word that usually appears about 20 times in a protest, arbitrary and capricious. Your decision was arbitrary and capricious, not backed by any facts, not based by anything any reasonable person would come up with. You're just bad people. So that's what protests are. You did something wrong. So can you extend it? Should you extend it? How many people think in that scenario you should extend? How many people think you shouldn't extend? How many people think it depends? That should be everybody now by now, right? Can you extend? Yes. This is essentially the same situation as example 5, so the answers to example 5 also apply here. Should you extend? It depends. There you are. You can never go wrong with it depends. Per Comar 2110-0211, for the most part, protesting vendors are to be given the opportunity to have their protest or appeal formally considered and answered, while there is still the opportunity to benefit if the protest or appeal is upheld. I'm protesting, hold off an award, so if I prevail, I can get that award. Don't take it away from me. I.e., they may be awarded the contract or be successful in obtaining some other requested action, such as a reevaluation, recompetition, eliminate of a competitor, etc., if they win. However, we talked about that, permits it to be awarded in the face of protest, and here's the standard. If the Board of Public Works finds that execution of the contract without delay is necessary to protect substantial state interests. And this is a situation that has happened. If funding from a federal grant will be lost so that by the time a decision is received, it's moot since there's no longer funds to pay for the contract. The only one I know of that actually was voted favorably by the controller was this type of situation. Under ARA, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the State Department of Transportation had received money that had to be expended by a specific date. And what they said, and there was a protest against the award of the contract to go ahead and do the construction work that the money was going to pay for. And what transportation said is, we have in writing from the federal government that if we don't spend the money by this date, it's gone. They're going to take it back and give it to somebody else. And if we allow the appeal process to take its normal course, it won't be awarded in time for us to get the work done, which means we'll lose the money. And in that instance, the controller voted to award in the face of protest. But even the $20 million, he voted no. So it's there, but it's rarely implemented. So if a case can be made due to a substantial state interest for awarding the new contract rather than extending the current contract, and either the BPW or the appropriate control agency approves the new award on a substantial state interest basis, the contract does not have to be extended with the protesting incumbent under that very narrow circumstance.
Question.
Otherwise, yes, you have to extend.
Would the contractor still have the right to take it on up the line, appeal to the court and so forth?
If the Board of Public Works approved it,
Approved it without, in spite of the protest?
well, again, if they have appealed it to the Board of Contract Appeals, they can still go forward and get a decision by the Board of Contract Appeals, and they can still appeal that to a circuit court. So it can happen, but it hasn't happened. The only instance I'm aware of that is even close to that is one time about 10 years ago, Bowie University had a food service contract that they did not award to their incumbent, and the incumbent protested. And Bowie, for whatever reason, came to the Board of Public Works and asked for approval notwithstanding protest, and it was approved by the Board of Public Works. Obviously, that was before Francho's time, or he wouldn't have voted for it. And at that point, the vendor who had filed the protest went to circuit court and sought and got an injunction to prevent the buoy from implementing the contract with the vendor that the Board of Public Works had just approved. But they got that injunction on a technicality. And that technicality was, I had on the one slide, that the Board of Public Works has to find that there is a substantial state interest and that it's necessary to approve without delay. And the translation of that is there has to be specific words in the board item that basically says that by approving this action, we, the Board of Public Works, find that it is necessary to execute this contract without delay to protect substantial state interest, and they must actually have in the board item what the substantial state interest is. And in this instance, none of that wording was in the board item the board approved. And so the injunction said that, in so many words, the Board of Public Works did not meet the requirement for approving the item because the item did not have the wording that says the board was even aware there was a protest and they were awarding in the face of protest. So as soon as that injunction happened, 2 weeks later the item was back on the agenda with the required wording. The Board of Public Works approved it again, now with all the required wording, and when the vendor went back to the court for them to give them an injunction again, the court said no. The only thing we said is the wording wasn't there. They went back and got the wording. That's it. We're out of the picture now. So it went ahead and was awarded to the other vendor at that point. It's not something that happens. All right, let's see. What if the agency can't contend a substantial state interest is at stake? So if you don't have a substantial state interest, you can't go to the Board of Public Works asking for approval notwithstanding protest. So you have to go to the incumbent vendor to extend the existing contract, and the incumbent vendor agrees to do so. So all that is nice so far, and this is a complication. But now the incumbent contractor, to use Gary's example from before, now that you're going to them and asking them to extend the contract, they want more money than being paid under the current contract. Can you do it? Should you do it under those circumstances? How many people think it's okay to pay the vendor more money to extend? How many people think it's not okay to pay the vendor more money to extend? Why do you think it's okay to pay them more money?
Because you're asking them for more deliverables than what was originally contracted for, so they're owed extra money for more work.
It's past the contract expiration date. What we said before, it's a new set of circumstances. You can pay them more money. Why did you say you can't pay them more money? Why should they profit when they're the ones that are holding up? It's not because you weren't able to award. You're not awarding because they're the ones that are keeping you from awarding. So don't add insult to injury.
So the answer is it can be extended, but it shouldn't be extended.
We'll see if that's what it says. Can you extend? Yes. As already answered for this example, this is essentially the same as example 5. Should you extend? Probably not, for the same reason you said. The only reason the contract is being extended is because the vendor filed a protest and then appealed the denial. While it is one thing to afford the incumbent his due process under 21-1002-11 and offer an extension to allow the appeal to continue, it is another thing for the incumbent to profit in the meantime by being paid a higher rate. So
He's going to profit regardless.
He's going to profit regardless, but at least he shouldn't get a higher rate.
It's not rewarded for that behavior, no.
Yes, I had a situation where, due to protest and appeal, the vendor extended the contract for 11 months. And was a pharmacy benefit contract. So if you have Catalyst right now that you get your pharmacy benefits from, back 4 years ago there was a protest. It took 11 months to resolve the protest, and we won. And during that 11 months, and we didn't pick the incumbent. The incumbent was Caremark, we picked Catalyst. And during that 11 months, Caremark, by continuing, got $280 million under the extended contract. Now, all that was not profit, because that's paying the claims for the drugs that we all use, but at least some of that. And the thing that I remember, and I just casually happen to be looking over this way, I don't know why, but the lawyer who handled this protest issues a news bulletin 4 times a year. And the one that came out about a month ago, the vendor extolled the fact that they were able to extend a contract for 11 months and actually said that the positive result was that the vendor during the protest made $280 million more money. So it basically said, this is a good thing. Whenever you don't win a contract, just file a protest, just keep delaying things, and you're just going to keep raking in the money while you delay it. And even if you don't win, ultimately, you still got that money that you can put in your pocket. And I'd love to read that.
Was there a substantial state interest in money, in terms of money between the two vendors?
No, we didn't go to the Board of Public Works and ask for approval notwithstanding protest.
Because the money difference wasn't.
We actually, if you went on the financial quote, was we were going to pay $11 million more to go to the catalyst than Caremark. We thought, and that was $11 million out of a $1.4 billion contract. So it was less than 1% difference. And we thought that we were getting $11 million worth of value. So we can't say, number one, they were doing the job, can't say they weren't doing the job, can't make the case that we had to go and approval notwithstanding protest. So we went through the whole process, and it eventually got approved, and the vendor made $280 million more. Let's see. Without.
What you should do is, like, if they just file a protest just to delay the process, you should say, well, whatever profits you made, you have to give to the vendor that we actually selected. That would stop it.
There's nothing legally you can do to deter a frivolous protest. And these vendors know, they've got smart attorneys, they know that substantial state interest is a high standard. The board doesn't want to be making those decisions. They know a protest can last 6, 8, 10, 12, 16 weeks. That's more time their clients
Months.
That's more time their clients on the property. They'll make enough money through the extension to pay for their legal services and still make a profit. It's a business decision they make.
Isn't it nice to know that your aggravation is part of a business, not part of a business decision? Because protests just take a lot more work.
And I think statistically it's proven because we win the gross majority of all of our protests.
More than 85%. In fact, if we lose at the Board of Contract Appeals, that really means you did something wrong. It means you messed up big time. So, all right. That's not, on one side there's something that says, well, I'm not even going to get into that. I'm going to focus on this one. If the contractor, so they want an increased rate and you don't want to pay an increased rate. If the incumbent refuses to accept the extension of his current rate, this would likely constitute sufficient grounds to be viewed as a substantial state interest. So it's one thing for you to, because there's a protest or an appeal, to offer the vendor, the incumbent vendor, to extend the contract. It's another thing for them to say, yes, I will extend, but pay me more money in the meantime. And from my standpoint, that is totally unacceptable. And the very fact I offered and the fact that they wanted to take advantage both of extending, but also to get more money in the meantime for something they're causing, I think that's a reason to go and ask for the Board of Public Works to approve, notwithstanding protest. So in this situation, a request to award the new contract, notwithstanding appeal, would probably be warranted. Now, at this time, Gary will speak up. And shortly after his arrival here, he will remember this after I bring it up. There was a protest from an incumbent vendor who was providing psychiatry services out at Rosewood. And the incumbent vendor, who had been doing this work for many years at a very low price, came in and almost doubled their price. And so when the bids were opened, they were way out of the ballpark. And the incumbent filed a protest. And so the first thing, exactly this scenario happened. Gary offered the vendor to continue the contract, to allow the protest to be heard, but at the current rate it was being paid, not the rate, the very much higher rate that it bid under the new procurement. And the vendor refused. No, I will extend, but I want the price that I bid for the new contract. That was something like 40% higher than the next lowest bidder. And the answer was no. And what the vendor was told was, if you don't agree to extend at the same rate, we will be forced to go to the Board of Public Works and ask for approval, notwithstanding protest. The vendor didn't budge. That's what we did. And in that particular instance, the board did approve it, notwithstanding protest. And that also was before Francho, or probably Francho would have still voted against it. That was when Schaefer was the controller. So we have at least one situation where a vendor tried to do that, and because of it, we went to the board, and in that case got a favorable opinion, because no one wants to incentivize a vendor to protest and not only delay the things, but get more money for the whole duration that they're extending it. Let's see, the agency should check with the. So if you feel you have a situation to go notwithstanding protest, check with your control agency. If they agree, now here's the other thing that needs to happen, and here's the thing that Gary did in the one I just mentioned. You need to notify the incumbent that because of its refusal to extend the contract at the current rate, that approval of the new contract is being requested notwithstanding its appeal or its protest. So you're putting them on notice. If you continue to say, I must pay you more money, I'm not going to extend. I'm going to go to the Board of Public Works and ask for approval notwithstanding protest. And at that point, and this is the point, don't be surprised if the vendor backs down and agrees to extend at the current rate. If you tell them basically put up or shut up, at this point, if they believe you, they typically will come back and say, okay, I'll extend at the same rate. But if they don't, then you follow through and do what I just explained happened in that situation. And if they do agree to extend at the same rate, then again, you will hold off, you will let it go to the Board of Contract Appeal, because even though initially they wouldn't agree for the same money, ultimately they came around, it's signed for the same amount of money, so you wait and let the protest take its course. But if a contractor does not retreat from its insistence on a higher rate to extend, it should be expected that the incumbent will contest the proposed award either with the appropriate control agency or the Board of Public Works, depending on the value. Merely contesting the proposed new award doesn't mean the incumbent will prevail, but it does mean the agency should be prepared to defend its original recommendation. At the Board of Public Works, it gets nasty, because the vendor's going to make their accusations and your agency has to defend its selection. And so even if you are justified to go forward, it still may be ugly. I'm not even going to talk about that. You can read that. That's probably never going to happen. How long to extend? Because it isn't known when a decision will be rendered for an appeal of a protest denial, it isn't known how long to extend a current contract pending the decision. The usual extension runs 3 to 6 months. If you're talking about an appeal situation anymore, it's almost inevitably 6 months. Excuse me. To keep from having to, and this is a suggestion, because you don't know how long, the suggestion that we're making is that you don't want to do an extension, then have to come back and do another extension, things of that nature. So what you might do is one of the following. Instead of a flat 6-month extension period, have a shorter flat period of maybe 3 months with 3 additional 1-month options. So if it's settled within 3 months, you don't exercise the options. So that's one thing that you can do. Or the alternative is to have a flat 6-month extension of perhaps 6 months, but have a provision that the extension can be terminated after a given duration, such as 3 months with no liability to the state. So yes, it's 6 months, but we can get out of it after 3 without any incurred expenses. So that's things you can do, so you don't have to guess and try to be finite. You can do that 6 months, 9 months, a year, have some escape provision so that you get the initial term approved and you don't have to keep coming back. While each of these variations may be viable, the multiple option approach involves more work to implement than the termination one. If each option is over $200,000, then each option would have to require board approval. So maybe the easiest thing is to do the longer with the ability to escape after a certain period of time. Okay. Now, this is my favorite. Any questions on that concept? You're going to love this. And I don't mean love in a positive sense. I mean love as in a you got to be kidding type of sense. This, I'm pretty sure I can say without a doubt, this is the worst modification I have ever seen. And I've named names. And I will say that although this happened at this time, the Department of Human Resources has improved greatly since this time. 2002, well, August of 2002, Department of Human Resources submitted a request to modify a $24.3 million contract with the Martin Pollock Project for foster care services. The modification was about $2.6 million, so roughly a little more than 10%. The contract was to run from January 1 of 2000 through December 31 of 2002, which is 3 years. But the modification only covered through August 31st of 02, which meant it was 4 months short of the entire contract duration. If you look at that, you can see it's August of 02 to run for a contract running through December 31 of 02, which meant we're 4 months away from the contract being over. And for the period at the time that they submitted, they wanted a $2.6 million modification. There were 4 reasons provided for the justification: rate adjustment, adoption subsidies, state stop loss, and high cost placements, which you look at it and everyone immediately knows why they submitted a modification, because you just look at that and you know exactly what those things are. Rate adjustment is a well-known aspect of many human services type contracts, so many of you will know that. Every year on July 1st, the Interagency Rate Committee of the Department of Education sets daily rates to be paid providers for certain types of contracts, including foster care. Although the rates to be paid on this contract increased on July 1 of 2000, July 1 of 2001, and July 2002, Human Resources had not given Martin Pollock any of their rate increases for any of those fiscal years. So they're now almost at the end of the contract, and they still had not paid them for increases that occurred that were set by the Interagency Rate Committee July 1 of 2000, July 1, 2001, and July 1, 2002. So the mod request had a discrete amount listed for the rate adjustment. Okay, that was understandable. We knew what a rate adjustment was. However, the other 3 aspects of the mod were not known and required an explanation. There was no description. When the modification came into us, there was no description of what these 3 aspects were, why they were appropriate to pay them, and while each of these 3 aspects had a discrete identified cost, i.e. how much each one was worth, there was no explanation of how these costs were calculated. If you're telling me it's $1 million, how did you get to $1 million? So number 1, all it did was name 3 aspects. We'll name 4 aspects, 1 of which we knew, 3 of which we didn't, and nothing about how the amount was identified. So we did what we do. We asked DHR to provide information that justified, that told us, number 1, what those 3 aspects were and why they were asking for that amount of money for those aspects. And after a couple weeks, we still had nothing. So it didn't come in with the original request, and after a couple weeks, nothing came in. But they kept coming to us and saying, we need this to go to the Board of Public Works. We need this to go on the board agenda. We need to get this approved so we can pay this money to Martin Pollock Project. You're holding up this activity and all this money that we owe this vendor. So get a move on. And we said, when you give us some answers, we'll maybe get a move on.
Money we owe the vendor, that sounds like retroactive money.
Well, yeah. There's no question that most of this was retroactive. You're 4 months before the end of the contract. But even though the question wasn't whether it's retroactive, the question was was it justified, period. We knew it was retroactive. Okay. Let's see, because of all this, and one of the things I will say is that we have meetings for whenever there's something going to the Board of Public Works. At the DBM, we have a meeting to discuss the item, to discuss issues, and the governor's liaison to the board attends our meetings. So for like 2 meetings, we discussed this modification, and the governor's liaison is sitting there and listening to the discussion. And so what she did at that time was, because of the impasse, if you will, she went to the governor's chief of staff office and said, we need to have a meeting with DHR for them to come in and explain this. So it basically got elevated to what's called the quote-unquote second floor of the State House. So a meeting was scheduled for DHR to come in to explain not only to DBM, but to the governor's liaison to the board and to the governor's chief of staff office personnel why this modification was appropriate. But at this meeting, which was specifically scheduled to obtain details of the proposed modification, the DHR officials who attended could not explain the modification or how these aspects added to $2.6 million. And besides the fact of the 2.6, the unanswered question was, well, what do you need for the last 3 months or 4 months of the contract? So they were requested to come to a meeting was scheduled, people came, high-level people, and what they basically said to the governor's chief of staff office was, well, we don't know the answers to your questions. Obviously, it's not a good sign when high-level agency officials agree to participate in a meeting to provide explanation, have days to prepare for the meeting, and basically say they can't provide any information. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer to your question. But they did promise that all necessary information would be provided shortly. And then 2 weeks later, without any additional information, they withdrew the request for modification. This urgently needed modification was withdrawn. And some of you are thinking, okay, but that's not even the beginning of the story yet. Sound effects. This seemed like the end of the modification request. But in November 2002, 2 months later, the request was resubmitted for about $1 million. So one thing you'll see is the original request is $2.6 million, comes back for $1 million. What happened to the 1.6? A reduction of 1.6 million or over 60%. And this time it came down for 3 reasons, not 4, with the explanation that the high-cost placement aspect was deleted because they explained that the high-cost placement and the stop loss were the same thing. So now that we have identified that we were submitting 2 items that were the same thing, we're reducing that to only one of those items and reduce value. And, but it was not an exact amount of reduction between the 2 items. All right, coupled with the circumstances of the original submission request, the elimination of one of the 4 reasons for the mod, and the huge reduction in the requested amount, go figure, caused skepticism. So, by this point it's, all right, you got to give me lots of proof. Things are getting too dynamic here. So, even though you've reduced by 1.6 million, you still have to prove some things. This time the stop loss and adoption subsidy aspects were described as follows. Adoption subsidy. In order to encourage persons to adopt kids with costly medical, emotional, and educational problems, DHR agrees to pay adoptive parents for such expenses. This agreement is between DHR and the parents. Highlighted and underlined. This was never part of the contract for Martin Pollock Project to pay adoption subsidy. But for some reason, from January 1, 2000 to April 30, 2001, DHR asked Martin Pollock Project to pay these costs. Not part of the contract, but pay them anyway. And amazingly, Martin Pollock agreed to do this with no change in his contract. You want me to pay the money? Fine, I'll pay the money. For that time period, from 1/1/2000 to 4/30/2001, they paid $183,059 to adoptive parents for this purpose. As of May 1st, DHR started making the subsidy payments directly, as it should have been doing all along. But because the adoption subsidy, now this is a kicker, one of the many kickers, because adoption subsidy was not part of the contract, DHR told them they couldn't pay them this money unless they did a modification. Now this is 5/1/2001, and the modification didn't even come in until August of 2002. And all the while, this vendor is owed $183,000 for work they did, which is uncontested, but shouldn't have done because it's not in the contract. So number one, why did DHR ask them to do it? And the thing that's even more puzzling to me is, why did the vendor do it? It's not in your contract. Why are you paying out this money? So their reward for being a nice guy was that they paid the money and now had to wait a year and a half, in some cases from the first payment, more than 2 years before they got the money back. Now, stop loss was a kind of equivalent situation for children being cared for in foster care. To encourage Martin Pollock to accept kids with expensive medical and other conditions in foster care, it was agreed that DHR would reimburse 90% of all medical and other expenses over $3,500 per month per child. So that was in the contract. $3,500, Martin Pollock, is up to you to take care of any expense up to that. Above that, we'll pay 90%, which means you still have to pay 10%, Martin Pollock, so you just can't willy-nilly let expenses mount up. You still have an incentive to try to keep the expenses down. And once this aspect was explained, which it was in November but was not in August, it was easy to see that high-cost placement was the same issue, because obviously above $3,500 was a high-cost placement. So now we saw how the one aspect was the same as the other aspect and was duplicative. All right, so we understood. Now we understand the rate adjustment, we understand the adoption subsidy, we understand the stop loss. Now, since both of these factors, the rate adjustment and stop loss, were in the original contract, you didn't need a modification to implement them. So that was the next question. Well, since they're in the contract, and we verified they were in the contract, why do we need a modification to give money that was already accounted for in the contract? And the answer is because DHR, in their original request for approval, did not try to anticipate the value of these and did not ask for approval for anything other than what they knew they were going to spend from day one, which meant their approval amount wasn't enough to pay for either of those things. So they had to go to the board via modification to get approval to increase the amount they could pay the vendor.
So are you saying it was in the scope?
Yeah, it was in scope of work. The rate adjustment was in there, and the fact that the $3,500 and they would pay 90% above that was right in the contract.
Didn't we earlier say that they couldn't pay that because it was not work for the contract? Or am I confused?
That was the adoption subsidy. The adoption subsidy wasn't in the contract at all. But these two things were in there, but they did not have any money to pay for them. So until the contract amount was increased, there was no authorization for DHR to pay the increased amount. So, although they could have anticipated doing the value, they didn't, so they just put in the 25.3 million in the contract, which meant that anything over 50,000 required board approval. So we're definitely into board approval. We're now around $1 million. Once it was verified that stop loss and rate adjustment provisions were included in the original contract, and with the explanation that the adoption subsidy needed to be added to the contract, everything came down to verifying the accuracy of the requested amounts. So one of the 4 reasons dropped off. Here's 2 more of them. Here's the other one. So now we had the explanation of what the modification was to do. It was legitimate to request a retroactive modification for these things. So now the question is $1 million the proper amount? So, whereas normally DBM requires minimal verification of requested modification amounts, because of all these circumstances, we weren't going to approve anything unless they gave us copious justification for the amount they were requesting. The number documentation was not provided until around December 1st, so it took them another 3 weeks to give us, now that they've explained it, took another 3 weeks to give us the justification for the numbers. And you will love this, because this is the same individual who is discussed here. The first real explanation of the stop loss provision did not come from DHR, it came from the lawyer that Martin Pollock Project hired to try to get the monies they should have been had for 2 years. The lawyer called me, and I'm kind of cautiously sharing the issues with the lawyer, and I said I was trying to find out certain information, and the lawyer said, I can tell you that. And he explained it, and it made sense. And that was the first time I understood what they wanted, because I wasn't getting it from DHR, I got it from the lawyer, which is not a good thing. That you have to get it from a lawyer rather than the state agency. After receiving the explanation from the lawyer and reviewing the documents, the wisdom of requiring proof was borne out as described as follows. So the saga continues. Over 130,000 in possible billing errors was detected as soon as I looked at the spreadsheet. And I will explain why. The spreadsheet, and this is from the vendor, the spreadsheet was programmed to subtract the existing daily cost of care for foster children from the proposed new rate, with the difference in amounts representing the amount of the increase for one of the aspects, the rate increase. But for many of the foster children, the existing daily rate was listed as 0. And since the subtraction was the new rate less the old rate, if 0 is in the old rate, that means it's as if they're getting the entire amount of the increase as a new increase. The full amount of the new rate was computed to be what should be paid as the increased amount. And here's the example. So if the daily rate now was 95 and it goes up to 100, the increase is $5 a day. 100 minus 95 is 5. But although it had 100 as the new rate, it had 0 as the old rate. So that meant they were charging as a new rate $100 per day rather than $5 in this example. So it was evident by simply looking at the spreadsheet and actually looking at it, not just closing your eyes and holding it in front of you, but actually looking at it, that in total $130,000 of expenses were because of this. So had no way to know what was the correct amount. All we knew was it probably wasn't 130,000. And ultimately, when this got corrected, 90,000 was inappropriate, because 90,000 was attributable simply by putting the 0 there rather than the correct amount. So only 40,000 of 130 was correct for something that was simply a spreadsheet formula calculation error that the vendor didn't note, the agency didn't note. Another 47,000 was interpreted as not being within the contract. they added a 10% administrative markup, which would be $41,000. I looked at the contract, I said, they're not entitled to a 10% markup. Like, why do they think they're entitled to a 10% markup? And I said, no, they shouldn't get that $41,000. And there was another $6,000 beyond that that I did not think was appropriate. So aside from the $90,000 that were math errors, there was another $47,000 that I thought was not an appropriate amount for that modification. So obviously 90 and 47 is 137,000. So of the second request of around $1 million, 137,000 was in question, and that was after there's a $1.6 million reduction to begin with. So 70%, in total, $1.8 million was reduced from the original request, or 70%, as being not justified. And this is after it's submitted for approval. And if we wouldn't have questioned this to begin with, the whole $2.6 million would have gone through and gotten approved. So originally, DHR had done no validation of Martin Pollock's request for the modification. It accepted what Martin Pollock said it should be paid. Always a bad way to go. But even with that, Martin Pollock also did not do a good job keeping track of what it should be paid. They shouldn't have submitted the spreadsheet that had zeros for the current rate, as evidenced by these aspects, not to mention the $47,000 they charged that they probably shouldn't have. And I love this particular aspect. I'm going to DHR and I'm saying, here's $47,000 you shouldn't pay the vendor, and DHR wanted to give it to them anyway. Well, okay, we hear you say that you don't think it's appropriate, and this wasn't ironclad, this was my interpretation, but they wanted to give them the money. They basically said, well, we feel bad for holding their money for 2 years and having them do all this work, so it's only $47,000. Let's just pay them the $47,000. So, and they said it's nonprofit, it's for foster care, so let's not quibble over $47,000, let's just give them the money. Given the position of DHR and constant threats from Martin Pollock Project that it would not be able to make its last payroll without the modification, because they were saying, we're at the end of the contract, and if you don't give us this full modification, we're going to have people for Christmas that aren't going to have their paychecks because we won't have the money. We need, now that it's been reduced to around $1 million, we need every cent, or else someone's not going to get paid. So finally, we allowed it to go forward on the December 18th, 2000 agenda, after we specifically got the approval of the governor's chief of staff, because they had been following this whole thing, given all the back and forth, and even giving them the $47,000 in question. What we approved for the period they submitted originally, it was $2.6 million originally, we approved for $802,816. So obviously a $1.8 million reduction, and we added some money to cover the last 4 months of the contract, so the board item was $950,000 to go through December 31st. And if you compare what came in originally for the same period of time, that was the $2.6 million versus $802. And that is just an egregious example of an agency that is not keeping track of anything, a vendor trusting the vendor having very poor record keeping, and we can say, all right, it was just errors, just sloppy bookkeeping, nothing nefarious about any of those things that they did. Okay, so we will come back after lunch and take this, and then we will go to the new slides.